All right, so we're going to get going with our first panel. Hard act to follow there, but we will do our best. So this first panel, the focus is on content, AI, and antitrust. I think the rise of generative AI has really fundamentally changed the relationship between content and platforms. I think most notably with search, but certainly with respect to other platforms as well. We've seen, I think, decades of tussle over the impact of the disintermediation between content creators, owners, rights holders, and their audiences as a result of the development of digital technologies. But the generative AI era, I think, brings these issues into a new phase and raises lots of new questions. I think in the last several years, the focus when we look in the policy space and in the courts has really centered on copyright questions, which, as I've said to some people recently, I personally have endeavored to not work on for my entire career and is becoming impossible. But over the last year, I think we've seen increasing interest in the role of antitrust in this landscape and how the tools of antitrust enforcement and competition policy might be brought to bear as we think about questions of market power arising between content in many of its different forms, whether it's culture, news, entertainment, public interest content, and AI companies. And I think we are very lucky to have an incredibly expert panel here with us today to talk through some of those issues from a variety of different lenses. So to my immediate left, we have Madhavi Singh, who's the Deputy Director of the Thurman Arnold Project and a resident fellow at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School. Her research examines the role of antitrust law in regulating platforms and emerging technologies like AI. Next, we have Martin Dallouin, who serves as the Deputy General Counsel for NewsCorp. In his current role, Martin is in charge of all antitrust matters across NewsCorp's global news and book publishing and digital real estate services. And he's also in charge of legal and regulatory matters related to AI and tech partnerships. And then at the end, we have Courtney Radsch, who's the director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute. She's a global thought leader and experienced strategist working on AI governance, technology policy, and information ecosystems, and was recently named one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics, which is a fantastic accolade. So we're going to talk amongst ourselves for a bit here, and then towards the end, we will open the floor and hoping to have more of an interactive Q&A with all of you. Much of this debate has centered at the nexus of search and AI. Madhavi, you've written about how to conceptualize AI-related conduct in the search market as an antitrust violation under U.S. law and examined the implications of the remedy decision in the recent U.S. v. Google search antitrust case, remedy decision that came out last year in September. Some of us have been following that case very closely, others not as much. So I was wondering if you could sort of kick us off, talk a little bit about the relevance of that case to this discussion and what you view as the leading theories of harm at the intersection of search and generative AI.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. By way of disclosure, I am employed by the Thurman Arnold Project at Yale, and I have no other conflicts to disclose. To answer your question, I think it's important to look back at the relationship between publishers and Google. Initially, that relationship was symbiotic. So publishers allowed Google to crawl their websites for free, and in return, Google sent traffic to publishers. However, as Google's power in the market for general search increased, Google started extracting more from publishers in return for less. So it started using publisher data not just for creating the search index, but also for creating knowledge panels, news preview, Q&A, one boxes, etc., without any additional compensation for publishers. So this trend had been going on for a while, but in 2024, with the integration of AI overviews in the search results page, there was a decisive shift in the nature of the relationship between publishers and Google, because Google went from being primarily a distributor of content to being a substitute for publishers, as more and more queries were answered directly on the search results page without users having to click through to publisher websites. So how does all of that, how is any of that a competition offense or an antitrust violation in the US? Now, the Google search case told us that Google has a monopoly in the market for general search services. By virtue of that monopoly position in the search market, Google also holds monopsony power over publishers because publisher content is a critical input into creating the search index. And Google is abusing that monopsony power in two ways, or there are two theories of harm. So the first theory of harm is an anti-competitive tie. Basically, Google is tying the inclusion of publisher data in the search index to the use of this data for AI overviews. So if publishers want to be in Google search index, and all publishers want to be on Google search index in order to be discovered, they must also allow Google to use their data for AI overviews. And that constitutes an anti-competitive tie. That's the first theory of harm. The second theory of harm is that Google's conditions its use of publisher data for all these additional purposes constitutes an exploitative abuse. So it is the imposition of an unfair price or the imposition of an unfair condition. So as I mentioned earlier, initially Google used publisher data for creating its search index in return for traffic. But now it is using this data for additional purposes like AI training and grounding. And it is sending less traffic and less revenue for publishers. So as a dominant buyer, Google is therefore imposing lower than competitive prices on publishers. And that constitutes an unfair price, which is a competition violation in several jurisdictions, such as the EU. So those are the two theories of harm, and we can talk more about the effects, the short and long-term effects on both publishers and users eventually in the course of the conversation.
That's great. Martin, Courtney, what would you add to that or reactions to these theories of harm? How are you thinking about it?
I mean, I would just add slightly. So the idea of symbiosis, is this on? Yeah, okay. When Google started, they specifically said their goal was to get people off of the search platform as quickly as possible. And initially it was a one crawl to two crawls to one referral rate. Yeah, I did. You're fine. Oh, yeah.
Thanks. That's what it's, okay. Thanks. Okay. So just quickly, the initial symbiotic relationship was Google said, we want to get you off. We want to get people off our site as quickly as possible. We're going to crawl you 2 times for every 1 referral. That's pretty good. That reduced over the past several years to 6 crawls to 1 referral. We don't know what it is for Google AI overviews, but all of the indications are that it's very low. And I think that the failure to impose any sort of meaningful remedy, we know that the crawling, for example, with Anthropic is one referral for every 73,000 crawls. So it's no longer a symbiotic relationship. So generative search and, all these products have really shifted the balance of power. And I would also say that a theory of harm is that it was more than just extraction of value, but also, and more than just tying them into the use of the web crawler or the search crawler in order to be found and then coercing them into being in generative search. They were also forced to incur costs. For example, if you wanted to show up in preferential in the search result, you would have to implement AMP, the accelerated mobile pages, for example. So there were also hidden costs imposed by Google's monopoly because there really was no choice by publishers except to be on that monopoly. That's all I would add to that.
And I would add, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm very, very happy to see a room full of academics. I mean, I've been working on these issues, content, antitrust, and before AI for like almost 10 years now. And I remember a time when the FTC did its workshop in 2017-18, when there was really a scarcity of like good academic papers dealing with these issues. So it's really great to see some familiar faces, but also a lot of young people and good papers, and please continue. When it comes to Google, I think like it's very hard not to get bogged down to like the most recent issue, AI overviews, or AMP was the flavor of the day like 5 years ago. But it's really, I'd like to go back to like maybe a broader issue that is this relation between publishers, and NewsCorp is one of them, and the platforms, and the way we distribute our content. And it is clear that a few years ago, there was really two massive channels, search and social media. There's a big change happening, and we don't know where it's going to land. But the key question remains the same. It's whether we actually compete or whether the platforms bring us traffic. And that is really and when we want to, publishers, content creators, want to get paid, which at the end of the day, that's the only ask. We just want to get paid for the use of our content. We're past the point where we say, don't use our content. We just say, you're using our content, please pay. And when we think about this issue, like fundamentally from an antitrust perspective, it always goes back in any product to, do they bring us benefits, traffic, something else, discovery that we may not get without platforms, and maybe incremental benefits or like industry-wide benefits? Is AI going to bring a new sort of engagement for publishers, or is it going to compete? And when I say compete, it's pretty clear that for a long time there's competition on advertising, although advertising by platforms and advertising by publishers is kind of not the same thing. We're much more like selling ad slots, contextual targeted, but much less actually targeted, and we don't sell clicks generally. There's also a level that is competition for attention in general, and I know it's not a market, it's a big bad word, but that's the reality of it. It's like, is there something somewhere where they take our content to provide some answers, so that's AI, and we actually going to get less attention, and we cannot monetize that attention through conversions to memberships or advertising. And so at the end of the day, this is the question we're facing with AI products. And I will put, and it's, then we can get down in the details, because it gets very complex very quickly. The use of our data for training presents very different challenges than the use of our data for inference or grounding, answering the question. Very different economic challenges and technological challenges.
So just, we had talked about whether we're going to have any disagreement. So if I may, just a slight point of disagreement, because I think one of the big problems with the platform publisher relationships and the whole content and AI right now is that we acquiesced, and I say we as like the publishers or content industry acquiesced to the idea that was set by the platforms, which is the economic model is based on traffic referral. But the fact is their platforms, for example, search, is not useful without factual information. And so even if you don't click on it, right, seeing that there are 10 headlines or, whatever those blue links are that all indicate the same sort of thing, is valuable in and of itself. And there were actually studies done now in a dozen countries. The first one was in Switzerland that used a behavioral study to examine how people use Google search with and without the presence of news. And they found a difference in behavior, which they then mapped against the amount that Google earns in digital advertising in that market, and extrapolated what that would be if they did I think in Switzerland, they decided it would be like a 40-60 split. They then, a colleague of mine, Anya Schifrin, and her colleagues did a similar study here in the US, and they found that that would translate into more than $1 billion owned by Google and Facebook to publishers, just to news publishers, for the use of that content. Because think about it, it's not useful. These services don't exist without other people's content. So I think this very narrow conception of value determined by referral traffic does not work, and is part of the problem with the antitrust framework, I think, because we've had this narrow approach to determining value and thinking about the relationship. Because if you're looking at how quality content, and particularly let's take news content or scientific content, for example, in artificial intelligence, large language models, multimodal models, they are disproportionately important as sources of training data if your goal is to have factual, good products. and even more important for inference, grounding, or retrieval augmented generation that makes tools like generative answers or chatbots have fewer errors, which the industry likes to term hallucinations. But since these are predictive systems, if they get the wrong answer, it's an error. So you need that quality information. And I think that's where there was really a lack of understanding in the Google search trial in terms of the way that Google is going to maintain its search monopoly and or translate that into whatever we're entering into now. It's still Google is still one of the dominant, Gemini, its chatbot, still one of the dominant ways that people get information. So we're not seeing that, their monopoly is being challenged yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think reflecting on what came out of the Google search remedies, it feels like the publisher interest was sort of on the margin the entire time anyway. But there was proposals for something, some publisher control that could have been included, wasn't included in the remedies. And I think this sort of leads us into a much more of an open field to say, like, okay, well, if we think about the antitrust toolkit, like, what can we actually do with it when we think about remedy and intervention, not just if we say we have established some harm, like, what are its limits? What could we actually do with it? And maybe it's not the right toolkit. Maybe we talk about copyright, other things, but I'm curious for how do you think about what could actually be effective in the application of antitrust remedies to some of these questions? Or do you think we need to look elsewhere? We need to think about it differently, and also vis-a-vis these different use cases. So I think a lot of this, it's like, oh, we give publishers a control, and it's like, you're going to be able to opt out of AI overviews. Like, is that really going to solve things? Like, what would be effective, and is that inside the land of antitrust or not? Sure.
So I think that antitrust remedies and antitrust are flexible enough to include a lot of the concerns. It ends not just at terminating illegal conduct, but also includes restoring competition. And that is far more difficult to do than just terminating illegal conduct, but it is possible. And we have seen this, for example, music licensing is something that came out of a DOJ consent decree. So I think antitrust remedies are flexible enough to build up some sort of negotiation framework between publishers and search. For instance, I think what's lacking is not the absence of a legal basis for imposing these remedies, but the absence of a political will to do that. And I'm not sure if the absence of a political will can be remedied by having that's going to be an impediment even if you want to pass a new statute. In fact, it's going to be a bigger impediment. So what antitrust offers is that we have an existing law, an existing theory of harm. We've already established Google's dominance in the search market. So it's an easy follow-on litigation to bring. And there are plenty of remedies that can, I believe, within the framework of antitrust law, solve the problem of the lack of collective bargaining power that exists on the side of publishers. It's just the lack of political will to actually impose these remedies. And I think that's what we saw in the Google search remedies as well. DOJ proposed several remedies that could have restored competition in several markets, but it was the lack of willingness to impose those.
Yeah, on your point earlier, Courtney, I just wanted to react and then I will answer. I don't think we're in a disagreement, but as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about news publishing, news as technology, it gets down to, like, it's very tricky to define it. And in part because there's a lot of facts. And now that I also deal with like a lot of copyright issues and copyright litigation, I learned very quickly, like, facts are not copyright protected. And for a reason, because we want facts to flow and inform everybody. And when we think of news, we often tend to think of premium news. And maybe for premium news, and I'm quoting a research by Susan Athey from 2014, in Spain, there was less substitution. There was, more substitution. Meaning, like, if you remove Google News in Spain, like, people are going to go to the news website of the premium news. But there's a lot of variety of news publishers and publishers out there. And there's an entire ecosystem. And NewsCorp itself owns a lot of websites. So I can see that in our own data. Like, there's a lot of smaller publishers that may not survive. like without the search traffic. And so traffic is still a form of currency and a very important one. It's just like it's often misunderstood because if we look at news as a category, things have changed and that's real, and AI is presenting new challenges. When it comes to remedies, well, long-term, what I would like for content creators is competition. I think like that's always the goal. And if OpenAI says to the judge, what I need to compete is a search index, because what I need to get to do inference is access to a good quality search index that has been built over 2 decades. And well, that seems like a remedy that would make sense. In the meantime, OpenAI is getting data from SERP API and Google is suing SERP API. So there's something happening there. What I would like for content creators, and it's maybe more short term, is in terms of fixing the issues. It's always the same. Like what we want is transparency, control, lack of conflicts, and mostly transparency and control. Like, because we've been living in this world for so long where we used to not get transparency and control, like we almost don't even know what to ask for. But in reality, we would want to know what you're doing with our content, when do you take it, what is the value that it brings to you, how can I price it? Like those are simple tools. And from there, like I know an opt-out was proposed, was not adopted by Judge Mehta, but an opt-out is being discussed by the CMA currently. The details are being discussed between Google and the CMA, according to a post by Google last week. The EU is looking at these issues. So there will be more places and forums to discuss how to give news content creators control. But at the end of the day, that's what we need. It's control.
Yeah, I would add to that, I think antitrust definitely has some tools that can be useful, which several have already been mentioned. In addition, I think that you could look at, so if we're talking about, for example, search index, right? They're making that available to competitors. But there's still, I think, when we were thinking about the value of data, even making that search index available may not be sufficient to cultivate competition. I do think that is the right approach, though, because while competition might be the answer, another solution might be to regulate certain aspects of the general AI tech stack, or of Google's various different parts of its company, as in a way that, for example, requires common carriage, or does not allow them to benefit from their role in that. So we know that, for example, robots actually impose costs on publishers and other websites when they crawl. So we don't necessarily want hundreds of bots out there crawling to create a search index. We're already seeing that bots are imposing, some publishers are reporting that more than 50% of their traffic is coming from non-humans, which is not great because that's not translating into audience eyeballs or revenue. And so I think that in addition to antitrust remedies, we need to impose requirements, transparency and accountability requirements to build on that, for example, around robots. So what is the purpose of your bot? Making sure that there is a separation between, have specific purpose bots so that you could opt out of, for example, the AI training bot, but opt in for a search training bot. That there should be requirements for transparency about the purpose of what that bot is being used for, and an accountability for that. So, know your bot, kind of like a know your customer sort of approach. Also switching so right now the default has been an opt-out versus an opt-in approach to web crawling, which puts the onus on the smaller, less powerful player in general to keep up with all of the bots, what they're used for, to try to understand that. And we know, most of my work focuses on like the long tail of small publishers. Like they don't even have the technical capacity to do that, which then opens up opportunities for other, giant players like Cloudflare to come in with a great solution, which is, we're going to impose opt out by default. But then that's still giving a lot of power to another giant publisher or another giant player that is not helping equalize the power of publishers. And, this idea of, I think an antitrust solution would be to give collective bargaining rights to publishers, which they've done in Australia. There was the Journalist Competition Preservation Act here in the US, which initially wasn't envisioned to include AI, but I think it could have been. And so now a lot of these so-called news media bargaining codes around the world, so Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil, et cetera, are considering, how to enable publishers to have more power to negotiate those licensing. And originally it started for Meta, Facebook and Instagram, and then for Google search. But, policymakers understand that they should be writing those to account for AI. But that is not a replacement for, I think, a licensing framework. As Madhavi pointed out, if you try to ask every individual artist to go, figure out who's playing their song, which radio, who performed it, this is not possible. And yet we seem to think that that is possible in the content space. And so we need a regime that, requires payment for the use of whether it's, copyright protected material. And it's true that facts are not copyrightable, but the expression is. And one thing that's very important in AI training is the syntax and how, that is part of the training. And publishers have a lot of information that is useful for AI training that has nothing to do with the facts embedded. I mean, one AI company, licensing company told me that an AI company wanted access to magazine formats. Do publishers even know that that's a thing they can monetize? I don't think so. So there's a lot of potential value that I think publishers aren't even aware of. And so we also need to ensure, you said please pay us. No, it shouldn't be a please pay us. It's a law. You must pay for you. We don't go into a store and they're like, please pay us for that shirt. Right? We cannot impose an entirely different approach just because it's a tech platform. And similarly, they have essentially turned law breaking into a competitive advantage, because let's remember that this country has a very permissive fair use provision, which there's still cases where it's not fair use, but a lot of countries do not. And in our analysis of copyright laws in countries that have or are considering news media bargaining codes, some of them have fair dealing laws, but almost none of them would cover the full scale, essentially theft of content that has happened to now create facts on the ground when we're now trying to negotiate from that position. So I do think that antitrust, from looking at things afterwards, we should be looking at AI training, and that is where we can use antitrust. But I think that's harder to do, to look into the future and to prevent the creation of new facts on the ground that are going to create new monopolistic dynamics and make it impossible for content creators to have control and autonomy and monetization over their content.
It's a lot to unpack there. You guys have responses on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean please pay us as begging. I mean, I'm in the real world, and we're trying to and quite successfully for NewsCorp. And I recognize it's harder for others, and we're trying to help everyone because we believe we need to protect content creators. But we also have legal tools that are not necessarily adapted. And I worry when I hear ideas about new legal tools that create new regimes that are very complex and can be captured by other parties and are going to be very expensive. I mean, yesterday, the New York Times in their earnings disclosed that they spent $24 million for the first 2 years on their OpenAI litigation. I mean, we don't want to spend more money, have a battle forever. We need to find a system to be paid a fair value. That's what I meant. One point you mentioned, which I think is very important, because at the end of the day, we lose track of the facts and how technology really works, because we're so used of the internet working very well. But at the end of the day, it's a bot coming to a server and asking for accessing content and living with this content. One of the key flaws, and for example, I prefer to fix that flaw instead of creating more new regimes that are going to take 7 years. One of the key flaws that we do not know who is coming, who is knocking at the door. And so we don't have the ability to say no, essentially. We don't know the user agent, and then often that box is voluntarily provided, and often it's misleading or it's not filled in. And so at a very, very, very basic level, like that is a problem when we say we're being crawled and we lose control. Yeah, we lose control because we assume it's humans, and incentives in content production is always to put your content out there. It's good marketing, good discovery, and that's how you monetize. But here we're facing a problem where, you're right, more for the publishing industry, more than 50% of the traffic is AI bots. And you cannot even block them, or it's a game of like cat and mouse. And it's extremely a very expensive game. Like fixing that flow, which is also at the core of Amazon's lawsuit against Perplexity, Google versus SERP API, Meta and X filed against Bright Data a few years ago. Like that's a flaw, and what do we do about it? It doesn't sound like it necessitates to create, sorry, another complex regime, and that could help antitrust and competition without, again, creating another round of 5-7-year investigations.
Can I just quickly jump in? So I think a lot of ground was covered on what would be needed in terms of remedies, including meaningful consent, not just opt-out that are difficult to find, and also fair compensation, the need for collective bargaining, et cetera. I'll just highlight two more things. One is the need for monitoring. I think when we think about either remedies and antitrust or creating some other regime that will take 7 years to pass, we should think about how do we monitor these remedies, because we've seen that constantly. We've seen this in our experience in Europe, that even when remedies are imposed, big tech firms often find technical workarounds or other ways to bypass those remedies. So any remedy, either an antitrust or otherwise, should have some monitoring mechanism to ensure that platforms are actually complying with them in effect and not just as perfunctory checklist. And the second thing is, I think that this is an area that is very ripe for research, because people discussed a lot of different monetization model, but most of the work that is being done in this field is usually by startups or other intermediaries like Cloudflare that are telling us what's the best way to monetize publisher. Is it pay per crawl? Is it pay per query, etc.? But I think this is an area that is ripe for research. People should try, researchers who are interested in this topic should try and figure out which monetization model works for which type of publishers. What is the best way to take consent from publishers? Is there a choice architecture that works better than other forms? So I think that's an area that's ripe for research.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. I was thinking about that as all of you were talking. I mean, there's a set of constituents here that we haven't really talked about too much, both on the publication side and on the consumption side, which is the public interest, open access, open science communities, right? So people who want to be able to publish new information, new knowledge on the internet, make it available and make it broadly available, and not have to be subject to a regime where they have to enter into some sort of collective license in order for anybody else to be able to scrape their data, or even authenticate the bots that are doing that. And similarly, on the crawling and scraping side, there's extremely valid research uses to be able to collect data from the open web that have been, longstanding for decades. And I feel like as we go towards these solutions, which are, collective licensing, anyone who fits in this box can go in and figure out the license, or even some of these the publisher opt-in or opt-out remedies, or the bot authentication remedies. they all don't really take account for those kinds of use cases. So that feels like an important piece. I mean, we started getting into this this sort of spaghetti that's being thrown at the wall in terms of the technical solutions. Should we authenticate the bots? Should we try to have fewer of them by offering index access? Should the bots actually be a mechanism for negotiating payments? To me, it feels very chaotic. It feels like there's a large number of different sorts of experiments that are happening out there. And I'm curious from the panel's perspective, how do you see this shaking out? Do you think the sort of industry folks are just going to work this out? Do you feel like there's a role for some kind of intervention? To me, when I look at it, it feels like the devil really is in the details, and some of these solutions kind of are nonsense, and some of them make more sense. And it doesn't feel like there's any real holistic approach that's being taken. So curious for your thoughts on that.
So I think it's a good thing right now that there's so much chaos. This is competition. And it's excellent that you want more research on that, because we have a report coming out on the AI licensing, the economics of the market, what does the market look like? And it is full of startups, though we now see Microsoft and Cloudflare also getting into it. But when I look at it, I'm like, okay, well, there's a lot of competition for different models. Like, are we going to do a pay per crawl? Are we doing it by access? Are we doing it by use? How much is that going to be? I mean, one of the overarching challenges is the lack of information in order to establish value. So that's a challenge. I think from a competitive dimension also, what we're seeing is that, a lot of the smaller companies can't afford the legal ambiguity of copyright. And so they need to be able to access rights controlled data, right? To know that they have rights, they have the rights to the use of that data, which means that, the big tech firms are able to have a competitive advantage by not having to do that. And not only that, but Microsoft and Google offer legal indemnity to their enterprise clients if they get sued for copyright. That is very anti-competitive. I don't know how, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if there's like a part of antitrust that could deal with that, but that seems like incredibly anti-competitive because startups cannot do that, right? So startups are, I think, going to make this licensing community work. But what I'm seeing in the analysis of more than a dozen companies that are in this space is the big challenge is not really getting the publishers, it's getting the AI companies, right? But there are some. There are Perplexity, for example, is using a startup called Prorata to manage the licensing agreements with publishers. My concern is that what we're seeing is what appears to be like an emergence of a 30-70 split in terms of value, 50-50 in some cases, but with the Cloudflare and Microsoft, we don't have firm numbers on this, but from what I've been able to glean from talking to people in the industry, it appears to be about 30-70 split, which is the same split that I'm going to give you one guess. So the publishers are paying 30% for the privilege of having, Cloudflare or Microsoft handle the licensing deals. This is, the same split that we saw with app stores, right? So I look at this and I think this is not a great split to have, right? But when you have Cloudflare, which has 20% of, essentially handles like 20% of all internet traffic, that gives them a lot of power in the market. There are startups that aren't charging publishers anything. They're only charging AI companies. So again, we're seeing a lot of different models, and I think that's a good thing. It's not clear what's going to be valuable. It's not clear what AI is going to do, right? We've been, constrained by the vision of, AGI and whatever BS that is that the big tech firms are promoting. And so we have a lot of opportunities with this market, I think, to see other types of visions and products emerge. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there.
Did you want to respond on the, no, okay. I did want to pick up earlier, Martin, you mentioned the activities in the CMA and just think a little bit about the kind of international regulatory and enforcement dimension of this. CMA is now considering sort of publisher-oriented interventions in its significant market status designation of Google Search. There's an open case in the European Commission related to Google's use of third-party content and video to generate AI answers. And this is a movie we've seen before, where we have like multiple different jurisdictions essentially considering same conduct, same firm. What do you think we can expect from this, or what are your what's the best case scenario, worst case scenario in terms of how the sort of cross jurisdictional proceeding with these different activities could play out? What are you hoping for?
I mean, first of all, it's taken a very long time to get here, and that in itself is a burden. I mean, dealing with all the questionnaires, the requests constantly, and you kind of wonder like, what for exactly? And but I have hope. I mean, I try to remain optimistic, but in the sense that I don't think it's going to create a solution, a perfect solution. That I don't hope for. And I think there's 70 copyright cases in the US. I don't think a single one of them is going to give us the solution to this very complex issue. Same for antitrust, same for remedies. There's going to be a different variations of like stronger cases, weaker cases. But at the end of the day, it's like contributing a piece in a very complex puzzle. And so I see advocacy, regulatory investigations, the existence of an investigation itself may actually be more important sometimes than just hoping for the right remedy at the end of the day. And if it creates the conditions for competition, that I think that's what we can hope for. Fixing the disbalance of bargaining power between content creators and tech distributors, I don't think that's going to be fixed by any one of the remedies or any one of the initiatives. It's a much bigger, more complex puzzle.
100% agree. But with the strategic market designation and these inquiries, I still remain concerned that they are really not understanding just how integrated these different parts of the AI tech stack are. And they're still looking at, kind of these discrete product lines. And I know there'll be a whole discussion on ecosystems tomorrow, which I'm looking forward to. But, when we're talking about Google, it's not just like Google and content. They're also, one of the cloud hyperscalers. They're also in ad tech. They're leading on digital advertising. All of these are integrated. And I think that strategic market, reviews are important, but they take too long. We've had how many competition authorities around the world now establish that like Google is a monopoly in all these different domains? Like, let's do it again. Let's have another review and then figure out what we should do about it. Like, I think we need to move faster because we're not keeping up with the pace of technology. And, this too narrow view of where that anti-competitive advantage lies. So like if we're talking about content right now, we haven't even mentioned, for example, synthetic content, but now we're seeing, for example, not just to talk about Google, but also some of the other big tech players in this space, they also have an anti-competitive advantage in terms of the ability to, because they've been able to use content in and take that content in a way that does not abide, by law or is anti-competitive, they can also turn that into further anti-competitive advantage through the creation of higher quality synthetic content used to then train their AI products, which further entrenches their advantage. So I just don't think that, I think it's possible for regulators and competition authorities to get more up to speed, but it's taking a really long time. And even like in the UK, we still saw that their designation or their inquiry is still more limited than it should be into Google. And again, like even in Google search, we're only talking about Google search and not about YouTube, which is owned by Google and is this world's second largest search engine, right? And that's like that seems very clear. So I think we're still facing a lot of challenges, even though the strategic market status seems like a more fruitful way to go forward than like the narrow market analysis here in the US.
Can I just
Yeah.
jump in on the ecosystem effects? I think that's very true, and we already see that happening, especially with Google, for example, that there are a lot of spillover effects. So if you were to buy the two theories of harm that I initially outlined, that Google is a monopsony and it is using publisher data and all these anti-competitive ways, Gemini is built on the back of that, and Google is now integrating Gemini into all of its verticals. So it is now integrating that into photos, YouTube, etc., which means that there are spillover effects from its anti-competitive conduct into all of these markets. If Gemini integration in maps or photos makes it a more effective competitor to other rivals in that market, then these are all these spillover effects, which cannot really be called back even with antitrust enforcement. So completely agree with that. And we also saw the Gemini Apple deal happen recently. So big tech platforms already have these pre-existing relationships with third parties. So Gemini is now going to power Apple Intelligence, and that is another source of distribution for Gemini, for example. So I agree with you that there are lots of ecosystem effects and spillover effects, which is difficult to account for in a linear antitrust enforcement case. On what's happening across jurisdictions, I think one other point that makes this whole discussion a bit more complicated is that jurisdictions are taking different approaches to solving this problem. There's obviously antitrust, but there's also copyright, as you mentioned. So EU, for example, has the 2019 copyright directive, which grants publishers neighboring rights over certain online users of its content. And there's been a lot of confusion about whether the legality of certain conduct under the copyright regime should influence competition assessment of that conduct. So for example, some of the cases brought in front of German and French competition authorities about whether this type of conduct amounts to an abuse of dominance was influenced by whether it's unfair or illegal under copyright law. Whereas we know that conduct that is legal under certain regimes could still be illegal under the competition regime. But it's interesting because there's a lot of intersection. And if publishers, for example, give Google permission to crawl their data at zero price under EU 2019 copyright directive, then what does that mean for competition investigation of the same conduct? So I think that's another wrinkle.
Yeah, that's great.
I
And
just wanted
yeah.
to add something on this point, because I see the same dynamic in privacy in Europe, where the breach of privacy can be framed as an abuse of dominant position. And I've seen it following what's happening in the copyright field. I mean, it sounds a little bit desperate when you have to use two laws back to back to get to a certain outcome. And that, I think, is telling in itself of the ability of enforcers to get to the desired outcome in the first place. On copyright, and going back to the US, so my background is in antitrust, but I'm doing more and more copyright. I'm fascinated by how important, at the end of the day, in this whole conversation of copyright conversation and AI, the force factor of fair use is really critical. And it is, at the end of the day, a market dilution analysis. And that's what we saw in the early summary judgments in California, the Kadri and Bart's cases. And that, like, after all this work, and it's so much fact intensive and so complicated, it is about market dilution and market harm, something that we antitrust, people with antitrust background, are quite familiar with. And so it goes back to the original question, like, if the goal is to maximize output, which is the goal of in the Constitution that is underpinning the creation of the copyright regime. If the goal is to maximize output, are we better served by letting people copy and create, or do we want to keep the rights in the hands of the initial creators? And that is a simple question, and what's happening around it's becoming very complicated.
So we're going to do a quick lightning round, and then we're going to open the floor to Q&A with the audience. We touched on this a little bit before, but we have so many researchers in the room that I'd love for each of you to tell us what empirical research you'd like to see developed that would inform this debate.
So I already gave my answer, but it's basically, I would love to see more research on what remedies might be effective, what's the best way to get consent from publishers, and which monetization models would work better for which publishers. I think that's very useful and very good research.
Well, I guess I said it also, like anything on market dilution, market harm, and substitution between content and these AI machines or any distribution platform. I think like this is really the core of the issue, and that's where policymakers, I think, should focus on.
I'd like to see research to understand, how music licensing developed and, different types of licensing, what's worked, what hasn't, and how that might provide a blueprint for the era that we're entering in now. For
Excellent.
publishers and
Yeah.
other kind of.
Yeah, how it maps. Yeah, that's great. All right, we are ready to take your questions. We have mic runners, so just raise your hand if you have a question or a comment.
So I guess as one of these researchers who's trying to come up with some research in this area right now, one thing we're really struggling with is for there to be a welfare harm, which is not to say for there to be an unfair distribution, but for there to be a welfare harm, we need to have an effect on content production, right? So content producers get paid less and less content is produced. And it's very hard to isolate that effect. It's very easy to find an effect like, say, AI overviews means you get less clicks to CNN.com or something. But I wonder if you have any ideas from talking to practitioners where there might be already some effect in terms of less content being produced, or whether there's any analogies from these previous things that got mentioned, like, for instance, the introduction of AMPs, like these costs that were introduced on publishers, where one might be able to find a reduction in the supply of content.
I mean, I have a thought, but you probably have a better idea.
Well, why do you think that more content is better? Because I think what we're actually seeing is that the ease of creating AI generated content is reducing the value of a lot of these platforms. So it's actually having, I would argue, welfare harms.
No, sure, or do quality adjusted content or something like that, right?
Okay.
It's not about, it's like about the value of the content that's being produced. It's not about the number of words.
Okay. I mean, I think you could probably look at the number of publishers and others at closures, right? Firings, third of journalists just laid off at the Washington Post yesterday. So that might be one way to think about it. I think also, I don't know, if you could look at the harm, the welfare harm created by turning a great public good, the internet, into an increasingly closed environment, right? Like this AI approach is literally undermining the foundations of the open internet. We're seeing more and more quality publishers. The Data Provenance Initiative did a great report looking at the most important quality publishers, not just news, but of all URLs, like the top 10,000. Many, many, many more are putting their content unavailable, to Alyssa's earlier point about, not having content available, quality content available for open science or open research. We're also seeing more and more publishers adopting blockage. So I think you could maybe use those as proxies. And I think that as we think about welfare harm, we should think about like the destruction of the commons. I don't know, again, like not a lawyer, but it seems to me like if you had the commons, right, where everyone like fed their horses, we used to have the internet as a commons, and now that's no longer, going to be available. Like, can we see that as a welfare harm?
Can I just jump in? So when we talk about welfare harms, I think that there are welfare harms for both publishers and also end users that you could account for. And I'm not sure how much of this would be adequate proxies for what you're trying to study, but there are a number of harms that we see. One, of course, is exit of publishers, and also mass layoffs of journalists and editors, etc. And we have plenty of news about that, how work that was being done by journalists and editors are being replaced by AI chatbots at major and small publishers. So there's a lot of data around that about layoffs of publishers and also exit of publishers, I think that there is also evidence of harm to end users, for example. I'm not sure if that's also part of your study of welfare effects. So end users, for example, are harmed in both short and long-term there are short and long-term effects on consumers. So one, of course, is hallucinations. There have been studies about how AI chatbots have misattribution problems, broken links, etc., all of which decreases welfare of consumers. There are also, of course, long-term effects. The exit of publishers from the market harms consumers because now they have access to less diversity of original content, poorer quality of content because of the widespread nature of AI slop. There is also some harm. We can also talk about harm of deterioration in the quality of AI models over time. So there was this very interesting paper in the Nature which talked about model collapse or AI cannibalism and how AI models that are trained on synthetic data deteriorate over time. They are likely to hallucinate more, etc. So if publishers exit the market and more content online is AI generated, eventually there will be deterioration in the quality of AI summaries or AI chatbots too. So those are some of the harms. And
Yeah, and I'm going to keep piling on onto your question to give you more ideas, but I have the chance of having more time to think about it. So I agree. The first one is like the number of people who can actually make a living on creating content. And at a high level, I think that number is going down, which is not great. The number two is like allocation of value and profits between like the creators and the distributors. I think these economics have completely changed. It used to be that most of the money was going to the news publishers and maybe the newsstand, would get something, but very small value. I think if you look at where the value is going for advertising markets and collection of data, it's clear to me at a high level that the distributors are getting most of that value, and the original creators, who at the end of the day must have the incentives to keep creating and keep innovating on a daily basis, like they have less value to deal with. And the last one on, I think you can look at the cost of access to information, and I know most of this information is freely accessible, but I think it's fairly obvious today in 2026, we all understand that it's not free. Like we pay with our attention, we pay with our data. So we may see more advertising and we may be giving more data. And now there's actually options where we can pay for certain AI agents or certain media streaming platforms and not see advertising. So it tells you a lot about the costs of for the consumers of accessing information. And you can look at the price of subscriptions for news bundles or price of subscriptions. There's more and more subscription products.
One other one, just to build on what you said, it's not only news publishers, but content creators like individuals, influencers, et cetera. I think you could look at what's happening to their ability to monetize because of the ease of creating synthetic content and getting away from, say, just Google and Facebook, but Shine, which is big monopoly in fast fashion, apparently has been using AI to go through and create essentially competing fashion items based on what influencers are doing online. So like it crosses sectors. I think there's a lot of different ways to look at welfare harm.
Other questions?
I have a question regarding whether from industry you see how the AI summary affect the traffic, because I was wondering if assume that the AI summary will reduce the traffic to the content creator, but we also observe that some company, for instance, in China, we have an app called Radsch. Basically, they also generate AI summary when you search for some keyword. But personally, I feel like they basically use the AI to generate the opposite goal because they want to increase the traffic for the content provider because that is how they get the profit. So I was wondering whether from industry you see how it affects the traffic, whether you feel like it depends on how this company generate the AI summary, because if AI summary always reduce traffic, then it's kind of in contrast with some company, they also use the AI summary to increase the traffic. So that's my question. Thank you.
And it is a fascinating question, and one actually that should be further investigated. So I'll share some high-level views. It depends. I'm a lawyer, so it depends. But in the reality, for certain categories of content, like travel, like entertainment, like weather, like it does diminish traffic tremendously. And I think it is because of the intention behind the search or behind the question. Like, are you satisfied with a summary? Yes, you're satisfied that you were just looking for some ideas. And maybe, and again, travel, think about it like the AI tool is bringing something else, not just an article, but like very customized to your own research. And maybe that's even providing additional value. In some other categories, I don't think we see as much like drop in traffic, and the idea that the click-through rate is going to go down may not be true because people were looking for professional finance information or very like professional information. They actually may click more when they see that information on an AI machine because they want to dig deeper, go further, understand the source, understand the truthfulness of what they're reading. And so it really depends on the intent, and there's not an easy solution. Now, I will tell you, as always with algorithms, it depends also on how you program the algorithms. And so this dynamic changes every 3 months for every AI machine. Like they keep changing, they keep tweaking, like their intentions. Do we want people to dig deeper? Do we want people to stay there? Are we going to sell advertising? Are we going to sell a service? And so that's why it's so complicated. It's like we're testing in real time, and there's so many different categories of content and so many different ways to optimize your AI summary. Because at the end of the day, you tell the machine, optimize for these things, and the machine will.
And I would just add to that another dynamic, which is whether or not a publisher has a deal with an AI platform will affect the visibility. And so, and in general, there's more industry research than there is academic research on traffic referral levels. And obviously we don't have any information from the platforms, and we're not going to believe what they tell us anyways without evidence. But what we understand is that there is overarching drop in traffic for sure. However, when a publisher does show up in generative AI overviews, it can have potentially beneficial traffic impacts. And so then that has implications for publishers, right? So who has deals? Only the biggest publishers. None of the long tail of like local news or, smaller publishers, trade publications, et cetera. Or for example, Reddit, right? Reddit has a deal with Google. It's showing up a lot, which, we could debate whether that's quality information or not, but, that is, so that's had a beneficial impact on traffic. And I think, I don't remember the stats off the top of my head, but I think it's in my paper. So that has had a big impact. So, that also is another factor.
Question over here.
Thank you for a great panel. Maybe a big picture question. How do you imagine a decentralized future for tech, right? What will be the business model? How companies going to make the money? Specifically, how we break the advertising monopoly when the political economy is really against that over and over again.
The bots are going to do everything.
Yeah. Are we hopeless? It's going to be centralized forever. Because you've been looking at this for a while, right?
Well, I mean, in terms of years, yes, but in terms of like, I think we're going through a revolution of the way we produce and consume content. And the problem, it is happening very fast for the consumers and the businesses, but the reality is like I mean, you in the room, the academics, it takes so much time to think about what's happening, like for the data, right? I mean, like, it's almost like, I'm sure in 20 years, we're like, that's what was happening. We were moving to a machine-led information ecosystem. No, I mean, I think there will always be value for human-generated content. And there will be pockets of value. And the way you monetize these pockets, whether like subscriptions, very targeted events, advertising, marketing, that I think there will always be a future for that. But in the meantime, the disruption, the journey, I mean, I don't know when it's going to end, but it is going to be a continuation of like a lot of changes. And the pace of the technological changes is like, I mean, for me, and even as a parent, right? It's crazy. Like, I'm like, I don't even know what to do with these algorithms and information and media for my kids. And I work in that space. So like, it's moving super fast and we're just trying to catch up.
I think that if we don't break up the companies and prevent them from, having dominance again in cloud, in, data center production, in, the ability to obtain content, right? Who's licensing content or creating content? It's the biggest companies, and not, maps, like autonomous vehicles, all of this is all intertwined. It's a handful of US or Chinese big tech companies that dominate in pretty much like all of these fields. And yeah, there are startups, but they're all dependent on their clouds, their data centers, their chips, like, the core infrastructure. So we have to deal with that. And what I am worried about is that I'm so glad there's an optimist here. I am concerned that we're going to see tech companies funding journalism or buying news organizations or paying, like Facebook did during the writers' strike, paying actors to create content in order to train their algorithms. And they actually get a dual benefit because there's this one AI company that has created hyper-local newsrooms that use their AI product in order to like get YouTube videos of council meetings and basically do local reporting with their AI. And then they have one editor overseeing multiple newsrooms. So that's a very like low cost, right? You've only got to pay one guy, one, healthcare benefit or whatever. And so then they're also then using the information because there's quality control to then train so they're kind of getting both sides of it. We just heard OpenAI yesterday talk about the importance of local news, which is great. $1 million, per week, I think it was, searches, but I think that was only in the US. They didn't specify. But they're talking now about like partnerships. You cannot have a partnership between a local news organization that maybe like makes $100,000 or even $1 million a year and a, $500 billion company. That's not a partnership, that's serfdom, right? So I am less optimistic that if we don't break up the power, these companies have $1 trillion valuations and they're translating that economic power into political power, right? So we have techno-fascism in this country that is going to prevent us from having impactful interventions to actually break up because there is now an alignment in an even greater way than in the past between the political and economic power. So I think your question is not only important for the decentralized web, but like the future of democracy. I hope I'm not the last question.
We're going to take one more question, but go ahead, Madhavi, and then we'll come to
Can I
Felix.
be the naive optimist on the panel? I mean, it's really difficult, but if the moment of paradigm shift is probably the best moment that one could potentially find for overhauling entrenched economic models and business models. So if we are moving from general search, which is very difficult to undo, and had an advertising model which created incentives for Google to keep users on their own properties, and now we're moving to a system where the gateway to the internet might change. It could be AI mode, it could be AI overview or something else. It's renewed opportunity for optimism. We could move to other forms of monetization, and we talked about a few here. And there's a fork in the road. We could very well go down the path
We're
that
going down that.
yes, but there's also opportunity because there's clearly change afoot.
Great. I think we have time for one more over here.
Hi. This question is a little addressed to Martin, but whoever has an answer is welcome. I was wondering if you could expound on when you said sort of the fourth question on fair use is an opportunity to, pursue some of these is an opportunity to pursue publisher interest within the context of the legal framework of antitrust in the US. Because when we talk about there being a lack of political will, but not necessarily a lack of potential remedies in the US framework, I think you might get flack from, like, the courts are bound by things like the Google Books case and other precedent. And so I'm wondering how the fourth component of fair use might be an opportunity for publishers to sort of make their case anew.
Well, I think Google Books is a very good place to start. It is an important precedent whereby the court found that because Google Books, in a set of very defined conditions and guardrails, that's the problem. Like, all these copyright decisions are going to be so fact specific. I could tell you, like, another case is going to be different, but the court said because it was essentially allowing discovery in these guardrails that Google had put in place, it was going to be deemed fair use. Like, then you're going to look, if you want to do an economic analysis of what it means, you should look at what is the value that is going to Google and versus what is the value of that discovery for the book publishers. And if you take the same analysis for some of these AI cases, like then you would do like the same analysis. Like, are you getting traffic under the current guardrails, which is a challenge because they change all the time. But under the current guardrails, are you getting traffic or are you going to be replaced? If the platform is saying, come to me and you won't have to click, it's pretty clear to me that the content creator is being replaced. And you can claim Google Books as much as you want. Like Google Books said, when there is discovery under certain guardrails, it might be deemed basically transformative and fair use. That is the analysis, which I think is sort of an economic analysis. And it talks about the incentives of creating content in the first place.
And I would just add to that, because this is the fourth prong of market replacement, was why we decided to do a research into this emerging content license place. And, you know, there are entire like virtual newspapers. There's a ChatGPT shop and many like LLMs that will literally create, you know, generative AI newspapers. So I think that would be great to do more research on, because that seems very important and has shifted since the beginning, you know, since ChatGPT launched. You know, we now have very much more data and a clearer sense of the role that generative AI is playing in market replacement. And I would just say, you know, I mean, maybe precedent matters, but then again, we don't have the right to abortion anymore. So does it?
Why don't we take a moment to thank our panelists? Please join me in thanking our panelists.